It is a pleasure to be here in Canada, especially today. I just flew from America a day ago. That seemed good timing. As it happens, I'll be traveling to North Carolina after this, so it is really a very special season to be watching and to be observing. And of course, it comes with lots of feelings for all of us, and I want to acknowledge that. But at the same time, it is also important to stay in the conversations that we want to be in longer term. So the talk today is based, as Ayala had already said, of my book, Constitutional Intolerance. I'm now finding that this indeed works, which is very useful. So the fashioning of the other in Europe's constitutional repertoires. This book is really an exercise in bringing together insights from constitutional law, from politics, particularly political theory, and also religious study, and sometimes a bit of theology, into conversations around coexistence and how we deal with living together with differences that will persist, not just now, but also in the future. It arises from a concern over constitutional law and constitutionalism, about the future of democracy, about the role of law in Europe primarily, as the case studies that we'll comment on later will make rather clear, is a rather European project. At the same time, the questions are really transcending the European context, and I think there will be resonances both with America but also other countries that you will probably discern as we go through this lecture. What I find really helpful to also say at this point is that to study something like constitutional intolerance also requires one to think more deeply around questions of what does it really mean to ascribe some otherness to particular groups. For a long time, discussions in my field have been about religion and sexuality, and these are often pitted against each other. And one of the things that I found important to do in this book is actually to talk about a range of minorities, so religious, ethno-religious, ethnic minorities, and sexual minorities, and say actually, from a constitutional perspective, perhaps they are in the same boat. I'll leave it to your judgment whether you agree with this, but we'll come back to that at the end of the lecture, I'm sure, in the discussion. So here is a brief overview of the contents of this particular lecture. There is a book cover on the left, which I particularly like. If you like the book, do order it or pre-order it. But here are the contents. So we'll start with some historical sort of perspective on toleration. One of the things that I found really helpful in writing this book is finding a language in which we can talk about intolerance that isn't just about what everyone makes it to mean. Because what does it mean to be tolerant? Does it mean you're just really kind to minorities? Does it mean you really don't like them, but you're kind of okay with them being there? Like, what does it actually mean? And I found it really helpful to find a hook in early modernity where there is administrative practices of toleration that are political, that are administrative, and that actually are much more structured than we might give the early modern people credit for. We'll then also talk about intolerance in constitutional law. This is where things get a bit more exciting, perhaps, for those who study constitutional law, because for a long time the conversation has been, in Europe at least, that after the French Revolution you had the rise of the modern state, and that meant that some of the religious strife of the past was now in the past. We were doing something different, maybe more peaceful, maybe more democratic, and that's a sort of story that we've been telling ourselves for a very long time. So what does it mean to say early modern toleration somehow managed to find its way into structures of constitutionalism is a very important question. We'll then come to an overview of my case studies, which I draw from 4 European states, France, the Netherlands, Hungary, and Poland. And in these cases, I've chosen to focus on 2 states that are largely liberal-leaning and 2 states that maybe a lot of people might see as illiberal-leaning, although for Poland that might be changing or not. That's another discussion. But what I find perhaps the key point here is that intolerance can occur on both sides of that political spectrum. This is not about which minorities you happen to like or dislike. It is about the constitutional structures through which we contain some of the disagreement and awkwardness that persist in our societies. What I do say is there is a qualitative difference to what is going on in the constitutional repertoires in each of these countries. And this is bound up with backsliding, as it's sometimes spoken about, but also around questions of national identity and questions of just proceduralism and sort of the boring side, the institutional side, as it were, of democracy. So we'll come back then to the significance for the future of democracy towards the end. Like, what do we learn from these case studies? Is there anything that we can take away from this? And I want you to think about one question in particular as you listen to those case studies, and that's this one. It is the question of how does the change that we are signaling this afternoon, how does that change actually have a potentially long-term impact? Is it just about this one case, or is there something more long-term going on? So let's start with historical toleration as a discretionary practice. What we find in the early modernity is really some of the rudiments of the discontent and the division that we still see today. But it looked different, and it was administered different. It was certainly looked on differently by some of the dominant churches, depending on where you were in Europe at the time. But what is really helpful, at least I found helpful in studying this, is to look first at what is the story that people are telling about their society. And I came back to this idea of the corpus Christianum, which is Latin for saying there's something that unites the body of Christ. So that might be political, it might be social, it might be religious, but there's something that really is about people, about the spaces in which they live, and the destiny to which they are thinking, they are moving towards. Now, I say here, this is very much bound up with the story of Christianity and the coming of the kingdom of God. This is a very real concern for early modern people. A lot of them thought that the kingdom of God could come any time. There's lots of moments in history when groups said it was going to happen in a particular city, and they would go there, and then nothing would happen. And it all, it leaves a community rather anxious. What is really the key point for toleration, however, is not so much the political imaginary of the Corpus Christianum. It's the language of tolerare potest and of dissimulare potest, which again are Latin phrases coming out of canon law to express that some decision could be made to tolerate a minority or to allow them to sort of be relatively invisible so that they would conform outwardly to the society, but they could have sort of their private spaces in which they were different. Now, what is relevant here is that this is a discretionary power. So it's not a right, it is a privilege that can be granted. This is an important distinction from constitutionalism. The other thing is that there is a recognition that you have the right to use the sword as the government or as the local authority, but toleration here means to withhold that sword. So you know there is something you don't like, you know that you have a power to do something about it, and still you decide not to use that power. So why is that? So there are some dimensions to this decision-making that are, as I said, more structured than we sometimes give early moderns credit for. Some of these pertain to issues of truth, like how wrong do they think you are? Is it just an error that will be here for a little while, or will it be there longer term? Were you a visitor to a town, or were you living there for your entire life? Made a huge difference to how your error was perceived. Second, there is the idea of unity. So how differently do you look? Are you wearing different clothes? Are you going to church at a different time? Are you going to a different building altogether? Are you walking out of the town to maybe go to a church somewhere else? Those are very visible expressions of difference that people cared about. If there was too much disunity, that was sort of a threat to the story of the oneness of that Corpus Christianum, of that political imaginary that I mentioned before. There's also public order and peace. Are you stirring up trouble? Are other people stirring up trouble because of things that you have said or done? Is there reason to think that there might be rebellion? Is there a foreign king that might come and have a look at how things are going? These are very real reasons to think from a public order perspective about toleration. What will help you to maintain good order, and what is going to cause trouble, either in the short term or in the long term? There's also economic benefit. If you brought in resources to the community, or you brought in trade, maybe it was not such a problem that you were so different. So this comes up a lot around stories around Jewish belonging, where there is conditional, often segregated belonging, but then there's often merchant communities that are attached to it. And the difference is really stark with Jewish communities that aren't trade-based, and then you see much greater levels of intolerance. The last one is loyalty. So if there is trouble, if there is war, for who will you fight? This is a very basic question. If there is going to be a war in your town or in your region, can we trust that you will defend us, or will you maybe be like a little bit like a Trojan horse? So truth, unity, public order and peace, economic benefit and loyalty were these sort of structures to decision making that people relied on. Toleration also translated in matters of visibility and invisibility. I already mentioned sort of the possibility that you could behave like everyone else and have sort of your religious difference in private. But this is really a matter of a spectrum. And the spectrum goes from comprehension, which is this practice of conformity, where you might go to the same church and do all the same things and close your shops when everyone else does, but then in private you do this other thing. It can also be what Benjamin Kaplan calls Auslauf. Now, Auslauf maybe sounds in German just like taking a walk, going out, but what this refers to is letting the dog out. And we all know what a dog does when they go for a walk. That is what this otherness is described to be. It's really evil, it's bad, and it's kind of like, you know, you do that outside, not here. So what is this practice? It is about people leaving the town. They might go to another town, they might go to a barn outside of the city walls, they might even go into the fields and listen to the sermon or have some act of worship. But then also walking out can be sort of a visible sign of difference. So if the group that walks out is a bit too large, then again, are there different solutions? So the next step on the spectrum, according to Benjamin Kaplan, is hidden presence. And this is where churches are built in attics, in barns, or synagogues that, you know, are sort of hidden behind a ring of houses, so again from the street you don't see them, or at least you might be fully aware that they're there. You might even hear the organ music and you might even hear the singing, but you don't see them, and this kind of matters. Now, again, when groups like this become large enough that it becomes again an issue of public order, there is then also parity. And parity or simultaneum is about people sharing resources, sharing institutions. They might be sharing the same church but have a different entrance. They might even use the same burial ground but again have different entrances. It might also be about sharing citizenship, and this is also about sharing offices through which you govern the polity. Now, these layers of visibility and invisibility are not some sort of linear trajectory in which toleration gradually becomes better. You often find that in times of trouble, communities revert to sort of lower levels of toleration, sort of to manage the public peace and order. And this is very interesting, because even when we look at the story of the Corpus Christianum, some of the historians will comment that the sort of unity, the story of unity, was pressed much more in early modernity than it was in the Middle Ages. And this doesn't square with our image of the sort of trajectory of Western society. But this is history, and that's different to the stories, of course, that we tell. So I think this is important to remember also in terms of constitutionalism, like having religious freedom or other freedoms are not sort of linear rights. These are rights that are constantly negotiated and renegotiated within context. Laws even give the space for a lawful restriction of this right, and that might occur on the basis of very specific aims. Not quite the list that is here, but public order is one that will come back again in the case studies. And I think it's just important to sort of start noticing some of the patterns of toleration in constitutionalism. And here is what those are about. I talk about constitutional intolerance as the use of power where you could have chosen not to use that power. So you're not withholding the sword, you've chosen to use the sword. And in the examples that I will give, I sort of lay out some of the practices that this might come through in constitutional contexts. So I talk here about constitutional revision and amendments. That's sort of the obvious thing that we might talk about. But the less obvious stuff is about sort of pseudo-constitutional interpretation of constitutional concepts. And it might be because you say that something that's written in the Constitution means something different to what we've always said it meant. It might also be that somebody is trying to say that they're interpreting the Constitution even though they've got no right or no competence to do that. There's also policies that can be pseudo-constitutional by invoking the Constitution, even though, again, they might be quite unconstitutional. This is exactly the tension that I want you to think about, because on the one hand, constitutional intolerance can sort of mean, is this constitutional after all, or is there something going on that sort of creates that tension? And I want you to think about that tension. So we're using power where we could have chosen not to. The next thing is the articulation of a fundamental otherness. the idea of the other, even in early modernity, wasn't just about religion. It was about a lot of things. It was even then also about sexuality. It was even then also about ethnicity, and in some ways, as we would call it today, about race. And I think this is really important because when we look at the use of power, it's not just about one particular minority. It's about how we deal with all sorts of minorities and the impact that we think they have on a society. I also say that constitutional intolerance comes with a tangible impact on public space. So there's something about the visibility that comes up again. And the way that I came to this topic is really because in my home country, in the Netherlands, we used to say we are very tolerant, but let's keep the religion behind the front door. And I found that such an interesting inversion of the story of visibility that came with toleration. So how have we come to a place where we talk about us being tolerant while we still say behind the front door, like, I don't really want to be bothered by this, thank you very much. Then the last thing is that I say it occurs in both liberal and in illiberal societies. Now, the case studies here that I've chosen are partly derived from countries that we're all paying attention to. Hungary, for example, but also Poland. But I think what is really important to do here is to also look at how constitutional intolerance can occur in liberal-leaning states. One, because they're often the first ones to lecture the illiberal-leaning states, and it's a good thing to have your own house in good order when you try and do such things. But it also is a matter, I think, of integrity and honesty, and looking in the mirror and say, is it just the illiberals who are doing this, or is it a wider group? So the case studies that I've come up with are in many ways quite specific to each of the contexts that I'm studying. So in France, I talk about the concept of laïcité and living together, vivre ensemble, as it is called in French. And what is really interesting, I'll say a bit more about this later, but it is the gradual sort of interconnection of the idea of public order, laïcité, and then the idea of living together, which in and of itself is not necessarily written into the Constitution. I also use the example of the Netherlands, where public order is modeled after the French model of vivre ensemble, more than the model of laïcité. And I say what we see here is a sort of stretching of a constitutional concept to a point where it's really a bit obvious that this is a stretch. And it's something that we should be careful with, because public order is in many ways a gatekeeper for lots of human rights. Now, in the case of Hungary, I look at the idea of a constitutional identity and the way that the constitution talks about a system of national cooperation, which means that some churches can get very serious and significant privileges from the Hungarian government, whereas others who are not so pro-government might end up in a lot of trouble. The last example is from Poland, where I talk about the anti-LGBT declarations. These are also known in the media as LGBT-free zones. Now, the LGBT-free zones is what makes the spatial aspect very interesting. But what concerns me here is more the functioning of these LGBT declarations and what happened with those declarations when judges got involved. So the first case study is from France. Now, laïcité is translated in many ways, often to do with secularism or separation of church and state. But when you look at the language itself, you might also just say this is about perhaps a lay-led state. This is a laïcité that is articulated not primarily against religion as such, but against the Roman Catholic Church, which at the time was quite important, and where senior clerics played a significant role in public life. What is interesting is that when you look at the historical context of laïcité, that the first laïcité act is from no earlier than 1905. So this is not something that we trace back to the French Revolution necessarily, although some of the conversations have certainly precursed this. But the concept of laïcité was very much used in the context of education in the late 1870s, very much as a way of saying, when we educate our children, can we do that in a way that isn't necessarily beholden to one particular church? The committee that then ended up working on the Laïcité Act of 1905 was partially made up of minorities, Protestants, Jews, and this is something that we cannot overlook, because in the stories that we tell about laïcité, we've come to tell this as a story of the state versus religion. But it was about the state versus a dominant religion, and therefore laïcité initially was very much about an institutional separation of church and state. And this secured the mutual independence of both the church vis-à-vis the state and also of the state vis-à-vis the church. Now, this Laïcité Act was amended in 2021, and what we saw in this particular iteration was an increased institutional control over religious organizations. And of course, what we're really talking about is not just every religious organization. The interest of the law is very obviously with Islam and with the presence of mosques. So this particular law prescribes that if you are on the board of a mosque, you must live within a certain number of miles from the place where the mosque is registered. It comes with requirements of accounting and of transparency about where your funds are coming from. And it's also asking people to sort of preemptively declare that they won't do anything that's against public order, which is a really unusual requirement to make of minorities, and kind of says something about the prejudices from which this sort of thing might have come. It also institutes the day of laïcité, for which somebody is responsible organizing. And this is to sort of put an emphasis on a local and regional level on how important laïcité is to French identity. Now, this is sort of the backdrop story to laïcité. There's so much more to say about this. I won't do that because there's lots of books written about it. But what I want to draw out here is the notion of vivre ensemble. And the notion of vivre ensemble was really developed from a policy perspective in the early 2010s, and then gradually made its way into constitutional thinking. What we find is that vivre ensemble really derives from utopian literature and is taking for granted that some people will always remain on the edge or slightly over the edge of society. So this is, I think, really important to our understanding of what this notion does from a legal perspective. Now, the other here is clearly the Muslim. But what is, I think, from a more technical perspective important to see is that vivre ensemble somehow gets entangled into the conversations around public order. Now, public order in French gets translated as all sorts of things. I won't bother you with that, although I think here in Canada I might get away with it. I think what is important to see is that public order primarily is concerned around issues of security. These are tangible, these are quantifiable, and when you write a policy, you just say, here is a problem, I've measured it, and here is what I'm going to do about this problem. But what do you do when this problem is mostly one of social norms and you can't actually quantify it? You can't actually say there's a problem because it has occurred so many times. That's just not how it works. Now, what is important is that vivre ensemble is giving an expression, a legal expression to these social norms. It's about what you feel uncomfortable with. If somebody wears a hijab, does that mean they're potentially a terrorist? Like, is that how we want to think about citizens in society? Doesn't seem so sensible. This notion was mostly used in the context of the prohibition of the full vase veil, which led initially to the SAS versus France case, which I will refer to again in the Dutch case study, because not coincidentally, after 2014, after this decision was made, the idea of vivre ensemble suddenly started taking off in other European states. Now, what is interesting is that the attributed meaning of public order here becomes about not being French. It becomes about gender equality, it becomes about social discomfort, but it is no longer about really security in the way that we have traditionally understood it. And the consequence, again, is a very spatial and very visible one, because you're excluding particular groups from public space in a way that doesn't really resolve much of a problem. So that is why I say this is an example of constitutional intolerance. The case of the Netherlands is no less interesting. So as a slight backdrop to this chapter is that I had the privilege of spending about a month with the Dutch Council of State as I was writing up a chapter of the Netherlands. And what is so fun about this is that the Dutch Council of State advises on every proposed piece of legislation. And when the verdict of the Council of State is that this was a particularly poorly written version of legislation, it doesn't tend to be made public. So when I was at the Council of State, I got to see all sorts of legislative proposals that are not public and that were rather poorly written. So this was a very important backdrop, I think, to my understanding of then sort of the 12-year process through which the Netherlands came also to a partial ban of the full vase veil. This ban is very much modeled after the French burqa ban, as we call it. And what is important here is that there were 4 or 5 iterations of a legislative proposal, and the first ones all failed, because every time that the government was talking about public order, legal advisors were like, well, what is your problem? What have you got any data? Can you quantify this? What is exactly at stake, and how are you going to resolve it with this particular law? Well, the government didn't really have much of an answer to that, but they came up with a whole list of possibilities. So they tried gender inequality, they tried the incompatibility of Islam with national identity, they tried the opposition to modernity that was projected onto Islam, they tried the idea of the rejection of Western values, the importance of emancipation, they talked about unsubstantiated safety risk, again not backed up with numbers, and then they talked in a general sense eventually around the issue of the separation of church and state. My favorite citation, however, was the phrase that there was apparently an enormous social problem. And the footnote to this thing was not a report in which this was quantified. The footnote went to a critical report from the Council of State that had in fact said there is no quantifiable problem, or at least you have not shown what there is. So this was my favorite citation. Now, what the turning point was after 2014, when the SAS versus France case had been decided upon. And it turned out that you could get away with the language of vivre ensemble without getting into too much trouble with the European Court of Human Rights. So, convivencia in Spain, vivre ensemble in France, the zusammenleben in Germany, samenleven in Dutch. There were all sorts of languages in which vivre ensemble suddenly appeared into parliamentary debates, usually mediated through far-right movements. Now, here the other is obviously the Muslim. It's not really about Christians here, it's also not really about Jews, although other groups will be targeted eventually by conversations that become about social norms, even when we are not talking about necessarily the full Weeswil. Now, here, living together, or samenleven, as it was called in Dutch, was about basic principles of living together, as the Minister of Interior Affairs put it. He referred to communication, he referred to the uniformity of practice. Now, this was even more interesting because the basic principles of living together were not specified. And this is, very interesting, because if you would have known what they were, surely you would have written them down. Communications was an argument that had been tried in Germany, and it was one of the things that had worked in some educational settings, but not in others. But the long and short of it was it didn't really help you make a decision in such a generalized sense of the law. Now, the uniformity of practice, again, is one of my favorites, because the social partners that were involved in the consultation had in fact said there was no problem, and there were, yes, different codes of practices, but there had never really been any issues with this. And they had in fact said they'd prefer that the law would not be enacted. The law even so came because there was a political will to do something about this enormous social problem. And here the other is the Muslim, the law that is the form is the law that interferes with the freedom of religion, or in this case particularly the manifestation of religion. And again, the consequence was symbolic exclusion. Now, this was all on a national level. The parliament got very excited about this several times. 12 years, can you imagine the resources put into 12 years of parliamentary debates, the advisors that went into this, the legal advisors that commented on this case, the sheer amount of money that is spent on a law that was never really a very practicable one. And that was exactly what the mayors said. So the mayors of the major Dutch cities were like, okay, you've got this law now, but it's not a priority for enforcement. Like, yeah, fine, it's on the shelf, and we will not say we won't enforce it, but it's not a priority. So this was very much the way around the sort of political discourse. Now, when I then worked on this book, I was like, surely I need to have some examples from illiberal-leaning states. And this is how I got interested in Hungary. Hungary was one of these countries in Europe that had undergone quite significant change. And in fact, the first time that I visited, the entire square around Parliament was under construction. And looking back, that seemed rather symbolic. Hungary went through constitutional went to constitutional change. There was a proclamation of a new constitution, or rather fundamental law, as they called it in Germany, because the Hungarian nation, much like the German nation in the post-war era, was not united according to the drafters. So there were some Hungarians living in Hungary and there were some Hungarians not living in Hungary. So they said this is a fundamental law, this is not quite a constitution, but it will function like a constitution. The constitution then mentions specifically a system of national cooperation. And what is important here is that the story of the nation is very much an ethnic story. So the constitution will reference the Hungarians and the nationalities that live with us, which kind of implies a we, which also implies that the nationalities are not part of that we and also are not part of the nation. So this is a very important sort of caveat to make at the start. Now, what does this constitution do? It does provide the room to the government to work with some churches, but not with others. And this reached back into some of the arrangement that Hungary had in the 19th and the early 20th century, in which there were several tiers of recognition. And that kind of came down to, are you a tolerated church or a recognized church or even an established church? This is, you know, very simplistic sort of translation from Hungarian, but there's this layering in legal personality. Why is this important? There was a new church law in 2011, and what this church law had done was this. They deregistered all the churches and said, if you want to be a church, if you want to have your legal personality, and if you want to be able to pay your gas bills and your electricity bills, you have to apply to Parliament and see if we think you are a church. Now, it went as far as to deny churches that weren't formally recognized even the use of the language of church. So you could call yourself a society, you could call yourself a charity, but not a church. Now, there was a lot of pushback against that, so other churches eventually were able to call themselves church. But what is really important here is that the registration was conditional. And the way in which this was made conditional had to do with their historical sort of track record in the country, the number of people that had been part of the church, but also, and this is really what it came down to, whether or not you supported the current administration. The decision indeed had to be made by a 2/3 majority in Parliament, which was conveniently held by the incumbent government. And that meant that if you came back and asked, can I please be a church again, you kind of had to say nice things about Orban. This is, of course, a problem from the perspective of constitutional law. Now, what is really relevant here is that some of this got litigated, and the European Court of Human Rights said this is a grave violation of human rights, in fact a grave violation of the freedom of religion. Even Hungary's constitutional court had said that even a procedure through which the law was enacted was unconstitutional. Why did I comment on the procedure? Because the competence of the court had also been altered to the effect that they couldn't comment on the substance of the law anymore. So again, very important sort of context. But fine, said the government, we will change the constitution. And so they did. They changed the constitution, and then they thought that their new law would be in line with the constitution and with international human rights standards. But of course it wasn't, because it was still being quite unkind to communities that were not re-registered. The other here is the unfavored religious organization. And I want to mention a particular church here, the Hungarian Evangelical Fellowship, which is a Methodist church. It is led by a Jewish Christian pastor who worked together closely with Orban and even had baptized some of his children back in the 90s. This was when they were both Democrats. However, this pastor in question and Orban had been developing into opposite directions, and they found themselves as opponents and even enemies. And it went as far as that his church was denied registration first, but then was sort of offered this lower tier of acknowledgement, which then meant that they could use the language of church, but they lost all their access to public funding. Now, the public funding was what supported their work with the homeless people, with the Roma community. So this was actually quite essential to this church. Now, what happened here? Not much. The church is still very much on the siege. What has happened is several fraudulent sort of accusations of fraud or sort of fabricated accusations of fraud. And it went even as far, and I don't think I managed to get this in the book because this is also so recent, is that the financial officer of this particular church was put into administrative detention earlier this year without a charge. And yes, after a couple of days he was released again. But for the Hungarian community, this came at a very critical time, because what had happened, Navalny had just been killed in Russia, and this administrative detention happened just a week after that. And what they did with this financial officer was put him on the other side of the country in a prison. So it had all sorts of echoes from the Navalny case, and I'm sad to say that doesn't seem too accidental. Now, Hungary is not Russia. We have to be clear about that. But it is very interesting to see that some of these practices do come out of symphonic thinking about relationship between church and state. In Russia, this is in the context very much of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian Federation. These resonances are not altogether accidental, but we have to appreciate the difference that Russia is as a fully authoritarian state and Hungary as what we call a hybrid authoritarian state. So the other here is the unfavored religious organization. The form is the church law of 2011 and the constitutional amendment that ensued. By the way, since 2011 there have been 12 or 13 amendments. This is sort of how casual this is dealt with. I sometimes say if Hungary wants to declare Mary Poppins Queen of Hungary, she will be Queen of Hungary next year. This tells you something about the instability of constitution making. And I think that is a problem from, sober constitutionalism. The consequence here is the pestering of people who are in the opposition. And this is really tangible because when you walk into some of these churches that are really privileged, they've been given millions of money to restore seminaries, to rebuild churches or to renovate churches. And from a public space perspective, what you see is that this sort of feeds into a projection of Hungarian nationhood that the churches are a very confident part of. Now, some churches welcome this, but also within the churches there is some murmur because things have gone quite far even this year with some sexual scandals where still the Orban government wasn't willing to part ways, or the church wasn't willing to part ways with the government, and some lower-ranking clergy have been quite concerned about this. But then the churches that you find of the opposition are kind of like walking back into the 80s or the 90s. There's no millions around these churches. They are functioning with the bit they had. I think when I visited the Hungarian Evangelical Fellowship, I was put on a chair that was half falling apart, but it was still functioning, so why would you throw it away? Very different ethos, very different attitude. The last example is from Poland, and here I come to the issue of sexual minorities. This has not functioned as much in previous chapters of the book, but I found it an important addition because it is sort of nodding to the pseudo-constitutional behavior that we sometimes see. So in Poland, there was an administration of law and justice, which, as some of you will know, was identifying on the far right end of the political spectrum. And what they had really capitalized on was this idea of a Polish Catholic identity and sort of the historicity of the Catholics, and the importance of the Catholic Church for the Polish nation. Now, this is not altogether about religion, it's also about politics, because if you can say you are a Catholic, it's a way to say we're not Russian and we're certainly not Orthodox. So it plays an important role in the self-identification of this country. However, not everyone is equally happy with that, even within Poland. And this really comes up in some of these family charters and declarations that one might have found in Poland. It's not just one charter, it was numerous charters, and these were adopted at a local level. And this kind of looked like sort of a local backlash to Brussels, a local backlash to the left, a local backlash to liberalism, but little less was true. This was very much an orchestrated operation, which was led in conjunction between the Ordo Iuris Institute, which is a transnational institute that, again, is very much on the sort of conservative / far-right end of things, and their goal is to change legal culture. Now, they worked together with Law and Justice, and what had happened? Ordo Iuris had put together this document in which they said they were interpreting the Constitution, and they made comments about what good family life looked like, about what a proper marriage looked like. And what they also said was what it really didn't look like, and that was where LGBT identities came in. What was important is that the document itself is steeped in legal language. The rule of law is mentioned, constitutionalism is mentioned. It's very heavy on legal language, even though the document is nothing more than a document from any think tank. So how come? And I think what we need to pay attention to is two things. One is that they provided a blueprint for these local declarations, which then were distributed via the central political party of Law and Justice, disseminated to local authorities, where sometimes with and sometimes without consultation of the city council, these were signed into law. Now, this was very soon labeled as the LGBT-free zone. And some of the journalists that have been active around this were, I think, very effective in sort of talking about this as a zoning or no zoning. Now, this kind of drew my attention because of the aspect of visibility and also because of the aspect of law. But here is a question, like, is a declaration like this even a law? This was a question even for the Polish administrative courts, and it wasn't decided on until it reached the Supreme Administrative Court of Poland, which said this: actually, these laws have such a tangible consequence that, in fact, we must treat them as if they are law, even though from a constitutional perspective, it wasn't clear even what article in the Polish constitution these declarations were building on. So they were saying this was an ultra vires or an outside of your competence form of dealing with the law. The other here is LGBT identities, the former these declarations and these family charters. And the consequence, as the court pointed out, was the mainstreaming of prejudice, of discrimination, and even the legitimation of violence. You might wonder, well, why does this matter? I think what is really relevant here is a sort of pseudo-constitutional language that you see coming out of other think tanks, not least in America with the Heritage Foundation, again, very strong on constitutional and sort of legal rhetoric, as a way of saying, like, this is a very legal sort of exercise, but also because the Constitution in some parts of conservative thinking is the heart of national identity. This comes back to some of the ideas of Roger Scruton, who is cited all over the far right. I don't think he himself would have been too happy with that, but alas, this is where things are at. So this sort of attempt at doing something constitutional, even though you don't have the competence, much less so the precision to do so, is a very relevant constitutional repertoire, even though it's obviously unconstitutional. Now, what is then the challenge to the future of democracy? I think there's several things at stake here. And first is that we need to track the impact of right-wing movements on the development of constitutional law and on the development of minority protections in the law, and not really just look at the liberal states, but look at both liberal and illiberal-leaning states. I think that we need to describe these repertoires with some measure of precision, because they can occur in other spaces and they can be used for other policy issues. I also think that it's important to notice in particular how this more slower developing notion of public order in liberal-leaning democracies is really quite undermining of not just religious freedom, but of a lot of human rights that are caveated with public order. Then I think what is important to notice is that there is a discussion here about the rule of law to be held. For some people, the rule of law is thick. Some might say the rule of law is thin, and that might, in a very simplistic way, mean, like, is this just about the procedures that you follow, or are there certain norms that we think all the laws should conform to? But what we see is that there is what I sometimes call a conflation of legitimacy with legality. And if you're trained in law, you will know that this is about whether or not there is a basis in the law for particular action, but also then whether your use of the law is actually legitimate. So legality is about the basis in the law, and then legitimacy is about the appropriate use of that law. Now, if you come back to the majoritarian way of thinking, you will hear more and more that the people want us to deliver, the people want X, Y, Z, we have voted on it, so therefore we can do what we want. Thank you. And that is really not quite the case. And I think it's important to see how in even our democracies, this sort of formal legal positivism is becoming important. So looking at the law as you write it as a majority and not asking too hard questions about it. I also talk in the book about the idea of cynical democracy, where we follow the procedures, where we go and vote, but we don't really care about the foundations of our democracy as much as we used to do. And I think this is a problem because of the risk of the long-term hollowing out of minority protections. And indeed, this is what we see in several countries where particular rights are fiercely debated, litigated even, and as some other scholars have pointed out, like Frank Ravitch, who is working in Michigan, is that this is leading to a mutual hollowing out of rights that get pitted against each other. So I find it important to talk about these rights on the level of otherness, because it helps us to get around that sort of direct confrontation that we've sort of grown so used to in the Anglo-American legal culture. And then lastly, there are some echoes of constitutional intolerance in Project 2025. I think what is relevant here is, again, the use of power to do something about the standing of minorities. There is something very concrete about the visibility in schools, in public spaces, in public institutions. So maybe that will be a separate article. It was certainly too early to include in this book. But I hope that you will take notice of this idea of constitutional intolerance and maybe recognize it where you might encounter it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marietta. That was exceptionally rich, and I want people just to wrap their heads around it, because we had 4 case studies and very, very pressing issues. I think I want to just ask you about the choice, the cases, because I think it's very productive, but also in some ways not necessarily intuitive in a good way, that you use the liberal and the illiberal cases. So is your argument that we should look at the illiberal because they might just be preempting some of the things that we will see in the liberal context? Is the language slipping from one side to another? I think you mentioned something very interesting about the SAS decision, which was a famous decision of the European Court of Human Rights, which actually permitted France, upheld France's prohibition of the face covering act that they had, a law that they introduced, which pretty much many people in the Human Rights Committee, at least, or community, thought that the European Court of Human Rights would not permit France to uphold it. So is that, later on you said that was used in the Netherlands and other places. So do you think, is this part, what is the story? Is it slippage that's going both ways? Or just give us a little bit more of an insight about why you wanted both these, again, sometimes maybe perhaps too strongly compartmentalized elements, the illiberal and the liberal.
Yeah, thank you, Ayla, for that question. I think there's different layerings to an answer, really. The first was that in my initial work as a PhD student, I was working on Western European cases, which, you know, if you trained in the Netherlands, it's a very exciting thing to talk about France and Germany, but you don't really go much further than that, maybe sometimes America or the UK. So I had focused on what were liberal-leaning states. And because my work was very much around religious freedom, what I noticed was this sort of increasing cooptation of the issue of religious freedom by far-right movements. And it meant that when I was critical of what was going on in these states, people started to make assumptions about me that were not necessarily accurate. So part of this was really to diversify my work so that it was not so obvious where people would maybe think you stood, certainly not give you the wrong impressions, but it was also an exercise in trying to speak to multiple constituencies and not just be part of the people who are happy about liberal states and unhappy about illiberal states, but to be able to engage in a conversation across the political spectrum, so that is both to the left and to the right. That's a very conscious decision that I made, also to include the Netherlands as a state where I come from originally. And I thought, you know, when you enter into this exercise of critiquing several other states, the very least you should do is also find a good case from your own country and sort of say, you know, we also do things not entirely in an entirely permissible way. So I think that is an important dimension. But I would maybe say that the most important part of this was actually an intellectual thing. And this was about what is really at stake. Is it a particular minority, or is there something more fundamental to constitutional law and the way in which these echoes of historical toleration are already inscribed in constitutional repertoires to the point where they can be brought out under particular political circumstances? And what we see in all these cases is that actually the initiative for this intolerance came very much from far-right leading movements. So it is also a comment on what is the influence of far-right movements on the development of constitutional law, regardless of in which context that takes place. And where these movements have a strong political representation, they might engage into constitutional revision. That, you know, that's something that's very hard to do. You need high numbers in parliament to manage that. But then what do these movements do when they don't have that power? And what are the other repertoires that are sort of quiet, not so obvious, that are still actually quite consequential. So this is why I found the example of public order really so jarring, and to find that in the Netherlands and in France rather than in Hungary or Poland, I think was particularly helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is fascinating. I already have a couple of people on my list, so if you want to, if you have a question, you can just raise your hand. But I'm starting Ron Hirschel, and yeah, and then we'll continue later on.
All right. Well, thank you, Marietta. This is it's on. Thank you, Marietta. This is fascinating, and as someone who's had the privilege of reading the manuscript, I can say that it's a wonderful book, and you should definitely read it if you're interested in these kinds of issues. I want to push you, following Ayelet's question on the choice of cases, to push you a bit about the clarity of the analytical, the crispness of the analytical story that you're telling. And in particular, there is this work by Gary Jacobson on constitutional identity, and the work of your, I think, Dutch compatriot, Wim Vormans, about the story of constitutions, and they basically make a claim at the most abstract level that constitutional identity is an independent variable or force, if you will, that is different from a given country's national identity or political identity. So some of the story that you tell echoes those parts of the I guess, causal mechanism that constitutions and constitutional law is an independent variable in this story. But then you also refer to the general context within which it evolves that seems to suggest, at least to me, that you're actually talking about national identity and the formation of collective identity and national meta-narratives, and that constitutional law is merely a reflection of those forces. So then the question is, what is it in the end? Or what's the role of constitutionalism and constitutional law and constitutional courts in all of this? Are they a dependent variable, or merely a mediator in all of this, or are they an independent variable? Because if you want to stretch the argument even farther, you can say that every definition, constitutional or not, of a collective, whatever that collective may be, inevitably entails the exclusion of people who are not, who do not belong in that collective. So the question is whether constitutions do it explicitly or not. That's part of the exercise of defining who we are. We are also defining who are not we. So then the question, the bottom line of my question, is it all constitutional? Is it political? Or both, or none? What is it?
Wonderful question. I think a set of questions, really. I think for me, the exploration started with national identity and the development of national identity. The conversations about constitutional identity, I think, are much younger in a way that they tend to be used to differentiate national identity from European identity, and specifically European Union. So we're talking post-1990s here. The other thing with constitutional identity is that it tends to be invoked by those who really don't like Brussels so much. So it is, I think that is a very sort of important bit of context to put into that question, really, because what we see happen on a political level is a conflation of constitutional identity with a particular narration of national identity. And I think I bring that out in the book in sort of showing the sort of cultural dimensions to this. Sometimes I look at public representations like museums or monuments or other public spaces of high symbolic importance, and sort of see what are the stories of inclusion and exclusion that they are telling. I think for me the idea of constitutional intolerance comes in very much as a maybe an example of the way in which intolerance can manifest. In the early modern period, intolerance could also be popular intolerance, for example, and I think we're seeing those sorts of intolerance also on the rise, whether that's to do with anti-Semitism or with the belonging of Muslims. So I don't want to say this is the only way in which we can make sense of intolerance, but it is important because it is playing with the most foundational legal frameworks that we have in place precisely to mediate coexistence. And in a context where coexistence is really not self-evident or obvious. So I think, to answer your question, I think that is mostly a matter, it's almost like a social commentary, or political commentary. How is constitutional identity constructed out of national identity, but also how is constitutional identity constructing national identity, so the reflective and the reflexive sort of side of constitution making. And I don't think this is always as obvious. And the language that is used are often related to bridge frames that speak to different constituencies. So in the example of Hungary, what we know is that at the extreme right end of the spectrum, there is an argument made that Hungary should be much bigger than it is. They tell the story of Greater Hungary. And when you see the constitution talking about Hungarians and about we and about the nations that live with us, it's kind of left in the middle, whether they mean the Hungarians living in the country or if they are actually concerned about ethnic Hungarians wherever they live. And then, oh yes, there is everyone else. So I think that is open for a reason, because it allows them to garner support from different constituencies. I found this quite telling, actually. When I was on fieldwork, I visited some of the spaces that might be called like extreme right pilgrimage sites. And you see that the language of Trianon is not just like the language that is used in the last couple of years. It's really a sort of imaginary that has been built over the last 100 years. And for some people, this has this sort of extreme right connotation where even violence is permitted to restore this. And then there's also the sort of social cultural measure in which the government is using this, which means mostly you lend some support to ethnic Hungarians abroad and you work with or against your neighboring governments to ensure that. But also in return, and this is where the two-third majority comes into play, you expect that they will vote for you. Because what did the administration also do? It extended suffrage to ethnic Hungarians beyond the border. And this group that is living beyond the border is actually the group that is enabling the two-third majority to persist.
Thank you so much. Tom Pavone, please.
Thank you. This is fascinating and incredibly rich. I wanted to push you a little bit on what are the sort of normative and practical implications of adopting your constitutional intolerance frame. I was really struck early on when you said, remember that intolerance is discretionary act, and it's something that's a privilege that could be sought, but it is not a right. And so I'm wondering here about what are the consequences about analyzing these 4 cases, all of which include government acts that you presumably find repugnant, but adopting the intolerance frame as opposed to the violation of a constitutional or fundamental right frame. Because a right, although rights tend not to be absolute, especially when they have to be balanced with one another, it's a very powerful claim to say that the government has violated your rights, and it usually requires the government to defend itself, often in front of a constitutional court, and make the case for a curtailment or a breach of your rights. It's a very powerful legal case. It's also a very powerful mobilizing frame for social movements. Intolerance, I'm not sure social movements really mobilize around we want to be tolerated. It's much more powerful to say our rights have been violated, fight for your rights. And furthermore, that framing directs you away from constitutional courts towards administrative courts that are often staffed by civil servants who are very deferential to the state. So my skeptical question is, doesn't adopting constitutional intolerance as a frame rather than a rights frame weaken our capacity to criticize these governments when they adopt these measures?
I love that question, and it's certainly a question that I've grappled with as I was going through the movement of writing this book. I think, first of all, it's an analytical comment, and it's building on early modern toleration, which was presumably not around anymore. And I say, actually, there's all sorts of echoes, and we need to be more honest about those echoes. But we also need to recognize that this is in tension with the rights language, and that the way that we are using constitutional repertoires is violating very real rights. So I do engage that question fairly early on in the book, precisely because I share the concern that you have. But I think for me, the starting point was that early modernity, like that flip point where we went from privileges to rights. Was it really such a clear-cut transition, or did some of the conflicts transform in the context of the modern constitutional state, but still might they be expressive of some of those intolerant reflexes? So it's in a way a commentary on how the law and how rights are dealt with. I don't mean this to sort of replace the language of rights. Honestly, any single scholar couldn't do that in the first place. So I'm not so worried that people will latch on to this particular concept in social movements, in the context of social movements.
Wonderful. I see a couple of hands, but I just wanted to first check if any of the students want to speak, especially about, I know you read about the French case. If anyone has any questions or any comments for Marietta, it's a special opportunity that she's here.
No, thank you for that presentation. I found it really interesting, and especially with this French example, just interested in what you think about how certain, like, I know we've talked about the far right a lot, but even other groups, say feminists and across the political spectrum, people on the left as well, that support this notion of laïcité because in their worldview they think it's about equality or think it's about sort of a communitarian way of bringing communities together, and like rather than dividing people.
Yeah, what I found when some of these restrictions first came around was that some feminist movements actually were critical of the law because they were like, women should be able to make their own choices. And something similar had happened when a couple of years before there had been the burkini bans, which are about the swimwear. And I did an article on that at the time and sort of noting how in the local decisions, again, there wasn't really the legal ground in terms of public order that they were pretending they were articulating. And thank goodness at the time the Council, or the Conseil d'État, the Council of State, said in so many words that this was again a grave violation of religious freedom. What I found most sort of almost hilarious at the time was that there was a group of women who then, who are not Muslim, will go to a swimming pool and will wear the jilbab and sort of make a point that not all women wear this because of religious reasons. So I found it a really powerful protest, because what are you going to say? You're not respecting the laws of the Republic, you're not really French, you're not really a feminist. Like, there were all of those things. And they were wearing the jilbab in the swimming pool. So I found it a particularly sort of fruitful form of protest at the time. I think in general what is perhaps, and this is maybe half another conversation really, is how the law conceptualizes religion and gender and ethnicity and race in a way that we presume to be able to read into a particular symbol the intent or the reason why it is worn, and therefore assume that there is a sort of contradiction or a tension. Whereas even, within Muslim communities, there is huge differences between different ethnic groups with the forms of headwear that is used. But also, some people might wear it for religious reasons. Some might wear it only when grandma is around. It is the sort of there are different intentions and different actions. And also, like, if you can wear it in some spaces but not in others, like, that is a lived reality that the law is not really contending with when it makes these generalized sort of observations about what apparently then a hijab or a burqa or a jilbab is. And I think we have to tread a bit more carefully, because it's not just with this particular expression of identity. I think it's with a whole range of identities where we read ethnicity into race or religion into ethnicity, and we're not actually being very precise about what we're doing. But I think that is a good way of critiquing what is going on precisely from the perspective of gender and feminism, where we might say actually these women have an agency of their own to express why they may or may not wear certain attire.
Okay, wonderful. Just keeping an eye on the clock here. So I think we have time for maybe one or two last questions, so please go ahead.
I had a question, and then I hear the other questions, and the question gets bigger. I'll try to just keep it short. My question, you had the 4 case studies. They're mainly civil law systems. However, they're very different, as you mentioned, between France and the Netherlands, and then Poland and Hungary. My question is about the intolerance versus the rights thing in a way. How much did you find that the constitutional structures of those countries, being the structure that they are, allowed for that flexibility of either critique or rebellion or resistance against some of those laws that came into play in those countries? We see it, how it played out in those countries, and I see that they're different, the way that resistance played out in Poland and Hungary, let's say, versus France and Germany, and Netherlands to some extent. But I just wonder, could you tell me a little bit more about your analysis of their constitutional structures when you were thinking about the different laws and edicts and things that came out? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things I hadn't quite realized, and this is maybe also a reflection of my training in continental constitutional law, is how constitutional law can look very differently whether you engage it in good faith or in bad faith. And there's a lot of bad faith politics going on at the moment, and that is, I think, something that even within my field, I don't think we quite know how to contend with. So to give an example, in the case of the Netherlands, is that there is no authoritative piece of writing on what even public order is. There's all sorts of cases. There were some references made by the Dutch Supreme Court to the German notion of öffentliche Ordnung or öffentliche Sicherheit, which are kind of two ways of talking about order, social order, or sort of order in the security sense. But in the German language, that is the other way around. So öffentliche Ordnung was actually about the social component, and öffentliche Sicherheit was more about the security component. Now, openbare Orde and öffentliche Ordnung sound really similar, and that was what the Supreme Court of the Netherlands even thought. And it was only after a couple of years that they realized that this was a mistake. And it had been pointed out by Jan Brouwer, one of the Dutch legal scholars. But it was really one of those mistakes that were just made out of poor sort of contextualization in conjunction with translation that was going on. And this was at the highest level of the court. So I think there's an absence of a clear delineation. And yes, public order needs to be somewhat moldable so that when you encounter unexpected situations, you have the arsenal to do something about it. However, when it's so nondescript and people can come in and make it to mean whatever they think it means, that can also be a very serious risk for all sorts of human rights, as I've pointed out. So I think that was a particular vulnerability in the Dutch system. I think similarly in the French context, there is some academic work done on l'ordre public and also de bonne humeur, for example. I hope I pronounced that all right. But this idea of social norms and security norms. And even in the French context, there was also this sort of recognition that there wasn't too much of an authoritative line on this. I found one document on the website of the Conseil Constitutionnel, so that seemed promising, but that was a very short document and it didn't actually say so much, except that it kind of say, yeah, it's primarily about security. But then where does it leave you? So I think this led me to think more carefully around those sort of what are the sort of the leaks in the ship, if I can put it that way. And it turns out there are quite a few. And now there is in the Netherlands a government that is partially made up by the far-right party of Geert Wilders. We are discovering in rather rapid fashion where all those leaks are, and it turns out there are many.
Okay, this is a very depressing note, but I do think it's actually a very good one for us to close. But I do want to invite people just to think about the topics that we have heard. What would be the implications potentially for common law jurisdiction? What would it mean for Canada, where we have common law and civil law, and we definitely have these issues coming on the agenda? So these questions, and also the question of what's causing what, and also power, discretion versus rights. I mean, so many issues which are very, very pressing in this country and in south of the border and other countries as well. So I look forward to welcoming all of you back to our future talks, but I really want to thank Marietta for a wonderful talk and a very, very deep reflection on very difficult issues. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all.